Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. And this is basically going to be a huge show and tell, more of a show than a tell. And I wanted to do this video for a long time, but what's put me off has been the usual problem of actually accessing all my books. Unlike a lot of YouTube channels where people seem to have lots of space and loads of money and what have you, I'm a collector first. All my money's gone into books. So that means that you will tend to see what's behind me, and there's lots of corners and things in the house which you'll never see because they're so inaccessible. They're surrounded by boxes. In this room, which is approximately, let's see, 14 feet long by about 8 to 9 feet wide, there are 37 really useful boxes, at least, and those are the ones which I'll just show you one now. This is a little one. It's got some CDs in it, the ones that lock properly. There's lots of other rubbish ones out there. They're the only good ones, and probably more, and a lot of them are really big. And at the moment, normally behind me there's a stack of others, and I've moved them out of the way into the bedroom because the video widow, my partner, is away, which means I've got a bit more space to shoot in here. So getting things together is a major sort of factor, really. So today, aside from all that, we're going to look at science fiction reference books. And within that, I can be quite broad. There's going to be sort of books of critical essays. There's going to be authors' non-fiction, bibliographies, all sorts of stuff. And really, if you want to be an expert in science fiction, it's no good just reading the books. You know, you have to do the reading. You have to read the books. But it's easy to forget that there have been decades and decades and decades of dedication in the science fiction community to critical writing, reviews, analysis, history, what have you. And that goes back to the beginning of fandom, and of course it's there in conventional literary criticism as well. And the irony is that a lot of the best SF writing doesn't come out of literary critics who are literary critics per se. It actually comes out of people who grew up reading and loving SF and became professionals. And some of those people, you know, stepped beyond the mark of fandom and got professional qualifications, and they have the perspective, they understand the genre. So those are important people. And in the past, I've talked about people like Peter Nichols, the first editor of the Science Fiction Encyclopedia in its first edition in 1977-78, John Clute, the editor of the second edition, is now a website. And I did a video a few months ago about the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, and I've noticed that some of the booktubers who've come up in my wake in SF are picking up on these reference books, and they really are essential. But I'm not going to talk about the two encyclopedias of SF and fantasy today. I'm going to talk about other things. And this isn't my whole collection of non-fiction books on SF. There are others. I can't get at all of them. I do have a problem with my legs, as those of you watch channel know. I have polymyalgia, and I've got to go and get my latest prescription later on. But I thought I'd get at what I could and show you what's what, because this is important stuff to get under your belt if you want to really understand the genre to an expert level. It's going to come across as fairly random. This is Michael Moorcock's Into the Media Web, which is out of print, very collectible now, edited by John Davey. And this is Michael Moorcock's selected non-fiction, the short non-fiction from 1956 to 2006. So Mike gave me this when I saw him in Paris. The interview is still up on the channel. And I used to have a copy. I don't know what happened to it, but Mike gave me this one and inscribed it for me. And, you know, this is kind of important stuff if you want your background on Michael Moorcock. There's going to be a lot of very specialised books in this, but don't let that put you off. Okay, this is an unusual one. 2001: A Space Odyssey and Lacanian Psychoanalytic Theory by my friend Daniel Bristow, who I work with from time to time. And this is a Paul Grave monograph. So this is the sort of book that's produced for academic libraries in a small print run. And Dan gave me a copy of this. And it's, if you like 2001 and you're interested in psychoanalysis, it really is quite something. I hope to get Daniel on the channel one day because he's a great guy. He's got a brain the size of a planet. And the only critique I've made of this is that Daniel doesn't have enough of a background in SF, in the literary sense, to do as much justice as he could. But this is about the film, of course. So there you go. That's the sort of book you never see outside of an academic library. Then, Philip K. Dick was one of my early passions and still is. And back in the 1990s, those wonderful people at Underwood Miller did a whole series of PKD non-fiction. This is In Pursuit of Valis, selections from the Exegesis, and this was the first of 2 projected volumes of Dick's writings from his million-word religious obsessive writings, his religious and philosophical writings, which he was working on late in his life. So if you're the sort of person who's keen on Valis, Radio Free Album Method, Divine Invasion, those sort of things, this is essential. The second volume never came out. I think that's because at that point there was a schism between Underwood and Miller, and they split as publishers after many years of great work together. So there you go. Now, most of these books are out of print. The vast majority, if not all of them, will actually be out of print. Some of them very rare, but you can still find things. I mean, Dorset Bob, Mr. Book 451, look on that channel. You can email him. He has a great collection of non-fiction books on SF. I'm generally going to show you ones about science fiction writing. I do have some on science fiction cinema, but they tend to be quite specialised and focused on particular directors and what have you. Anyway, going back to Philip K. Dick, Underwood Miller, as I say, did a series of non-fiction books based on Philip K. Dick's extant unpublished writings, and predominant amongst them were a series of books of his selected letters, and they did 5 volumes altogether. I'm missing 1 volume which I never bought at the time, and I really should try and pick it up at one point. They were done as limited editions, signed by the person who did the introduction. These are standard trade editions. I managed to get 1 or 2 of them signed, and this is the selected letters of Philip K. Dick, 1972-1973, and very beautiful, I think you'd agree. And these are fascinating because you get the real detail of PKD when he was going through that period when he wasn't producing a lot of work, between 70 and 74, and he was involved in the drug culture, and he was getting increasingly paranoid, and the pink light thing came on. So you get a lot of that sort of stuff in here. But for me, the most interesting things are his letters to other writers and people in the publishing industry, and you see his friendships with people like Norman Spinrad. So they're kind of deathless stuff, really. And as I say, there were 5 of them, so I'll show you some more. This is the 1974 volume. This one was published first. They were published out of sequence. And this one is particularly interesting because it covers the period when PKD realised that his agent, the Scott Meredith Literary Agency, which is quite famous in SF circles, American SF circles, is based in New York, because Barry N. Malsberg wrote for them. Norman Spinrad did at one point as well. He discovered that the accounting had been managed really badly, and that he'd been told that lots of his books were out of print, and they were on rack spinners all around the States, selling like mad from publishers like Ace, and he wasn't getting the royalties. And, you know, it could really have made a big difference. He might have lived longer if he'd had that money coming in, because as we know, he generally didn't have loads of money. So this is really quite revelatory, and that's 1974. That, for me, was the highlight of this series. And as I say, you can, when you read his letters to people like Robert Heinlein and, you know, what have you, really, really good stuff. It's fascinating. Then there is 1975 to 76, and I can't remember much about the later ones, so I need to reread them because it's been a long time, but the 74 one really stood out, and it's a shame really. These have never been done in paperback, and it is high time that somebody did a selection from them of his best letters. And the ones which I would focus on would be the ones to other writers, because I think they're of most immediate interest. So there you go. And finally, this is volume 5 for 77 to 79. And yeah, really nice. And these came out in the early 90s, and I bought them as they came out, so I missed one, which was a shame. One of them has an introduction by William Gibson. I got him to sign that at some point. I can't think which one it is now, and I'm not going to pull them out because they're quite a difficult thing to get back into the wraps. So if you like PKD, those are kind of almost holy grail things, really. New Wave. There's an awful lot of misunderstanding of what New Wave is. Some people seem to think that it's a period, that everything like in the 60s is New Wave. It's not the case at all. That, I think, stems from the idea that when John W. Campbell took on the editorship of Astounding, and from about 1939 to 46, the Golden Age, more or less all genre fiction, all genre SF can be classed as Golden Age at that point, because it's called the Golden Age, not because it was the best stuff, but it was because when fandom was forming and science fiction was beginning to reach new standards of professionalism, And really, you know, the fans of that period look back on it as a golden age. As Robert Silverberg said, possibly the real golden age of genre SF is the 1950s, but let's not make it confusing. So really, when you get to the 60s, people think, oh, it's new wave. It's not. There were two new waves, and they were related like by an umbilical cord, almost like Siamese twins. And they were the American New Wave, which was sparked by Harlan Ellison doing Dangerous Visions. And that was mostly a response to the fact that publishers wouldn't touch certain subjects, you know, things like sexuality and race and what have you. And even though people like Farmer and Sturgeon had sort of dipped their toe into sexuality, it didn't become a big thing till later on. In the UK, New Wave started about 62 when Michael Moorcock took on the editorship of New Worlds magazine from E.J. Carnell. And really, it was more focused on modernist techniques. There was taboo breaking. And New Worlds was a kind of counterculture magazine as well as an SF magazine. And in the 80s, Colin Greenland, science fiction and fantasy writer, who has been active for some time, he's still around, who coined the term gene rats. And the gene rats were the people who came out of Interzone magazine in the UK in the late 80s. Wrote this book, The Entropy Exhibition, Michael Moorcock and the British New Wave in Science Fiction. This is probably the single best book on New Wave. In fact, I can't think of any others. There probably are more obscure ones. But this is kind of the definitive book. I bought this new in the mid-80s. I've read it several times. And it really does focus on New Worlds and British New Wave. And of course, there was that umbilical thing because there were people who came from the States to the UK, like Tom Disch, Samuel R. Delany, John Sladek, and they did work for New Worlds, and they were associated with those writers. So this is kind of the key book, really. And if you can get it, do it, because it's absolutely brilliant. I personally think that the definitive book on New Wave is yet to be written. And some 10, 15 years ago, I did think about taking the challenge on myself, and I wanted to write a kind of social history of it. The problem with that is that, aside from the huge amount of work it would have taken, and the fact I was busy with other things, is that the thing with oral histories and things which cover people's personalities is that you can't tell the unvarnished truth until they're dead, because otherwise you get sued by everybody. And this has been an issue that several writers have pointed out, and it's something that Michael Moorcock and I talked about in Paris a while ago. How, you know, he says, you know, you have to be careful what you say because it can be misrepresented, it can backfire. So that kind of put me off, really. But, you know, who knows, maybe that's a retirement project. But unfortunately, you've got to interview people in their life, and it's a big job, and it is the twilight of the idols, the New Wave, it has to be said. So that's a great one. Brian Aldiss wrote 3 autobiographies. This is his first one, Bury My Heart at W.H. Smith's. This is signed by Brian. This is Hodden Stoughton, again mid-80s. Quite liked, very enjoyable. There's another one called Twinkling of the Eye, which I haven't read. So I must get that at some point. But Brian was a real character. That's one to watch out for. And of course, he wrote, you know, the definitive history of science fiction, Billion Year Spree, aka Trillion Year Spree, which I'm not sure if I've got out here today. I've got to think what it is. I do have it because I read it when it first came out, but I don't think it's going to be in this video, but it's been in other ones. So Billion Year Spree, Trillion Year Spree is something to sort of really pick up on. A book which was enormously influential over me, yet I didn't really realise it at the time, but going back to it about a year ago, I realised that it had sunk in and really sort of affected a lot of my thinking about SF, was Norman Spinrad's Science Fiction in the Real World, which comes from the early 90s, and this is a Southern Illinois University press. You see, you have to look into these things. Now, of course, because I worked in the book trade, I was always seeing publishers' catalogues and publishers' representatives. It's different now, it doesn't work so much that way now, but through the 80s and 90s, and up until about, you know, 2010, it was that way. So I was always scouring these things and talking to publishers about what was coming. I was looking out for this sort of stuff, so I was to pick them up. And this obviously was an American import. And this had a big impact on me. There's some great essays in this. There's a wonderful one about how cyberpunk is really new romantic. And I don't mean new romantic in terms of the sort of 80s pop label, sort of neuro as in your nerves and romantic as in romanticism. And I talked about this in my video about Mary Shelley. It's called Mary Shelley Has Never Been Cancelled. cyberpunk, romanticism, and Frankenstein. And that's just one of the things. But Norman's really influential over me, and that is a great book. I really recommend it. It's one of my favourites in the non-fiction SF canon. List books. List books are a problem, let's be honest. Recently, I think John at Sci-Fi Scavenger has covered a few of them. He's covered the David Pringle one, which again, I don't think, I do have it, but I'm not sure where it is, because I have these sort of things are everywhere here. I know that John at Sci-Fi Scavenger did a video based on the Pringle book, and the Pringle book was massively influential over me in the mid-80s when it first came out. It's called Science Fiction, the 100 Best Novels, and it covers from 1948 to 1984, and it was a huge influence of me in my reading at that time. It was just what I needed, actually. It's a great book. And there were a couple of others. It was published by Xanadu, and this is one of the sort of quasi-sequels. This is the Xanadu book, Horror 100 Best Books, edited by Stephen Jones. Hey Steve, who watches the channel. Stephen, of course, is the editor of Best New Horror, has been for years and years and years, and he pops up on Blu-ray and DVD commentaries now and again. Really great guy. And Kim Newman, who of course, you know, has seen every film in the known universe, and is a great guy. And it has to be said, I mean, Kim's a pretty good writer himself. And this is a foreword by Ramsey Campbell. And basically what this is, there are 100 mini essays in here by 100 different writers. You know, you could say this, it says they're horror writers, some are broader than that, and they each pick a book and write about it. And it's just incredible who's in this. I'm not going to read every name, but I'll just flip through all Disch, Mike Ashley, Clive Barker, Robert Bloch, Scott Bradfield, I can't remember which one Scott has done in this, Edward Bryant, Susie McKee-Charnas, Campbell, Basil Copper, Malcolm Edwards, the editor, Harlan Ellison, Thomas M. Disch, Dennis Etchison, Christopher Evans. It goes on and on and on. And this is really good. And it's a very broad definition of horror. It goes right back into classics. I mean, there's even things like Shakespeare in here. And it's absolutely brilliant. Really, really good. And when they did these books, they weren't shy of putting in things which were really obscure, which I really like. So that's one to watch out for. As I say, these are out of print, but, you know, you might come across them. Another one which came out around about the same time is Fantasy, the 100 Best Books, by James Cawthorne and Michael Moorcock. And these were a response to the fact that David Pringle's book, which is a paperback original, had done really well. And Moorcock took this on. Most of it is actually written by Jim Cawthorne because of other commitments. I don't think Mike could put as much in. It's a lovely, lovely book. And again, it's got all sorts of great stuff in it, and I learned an awful lot about the outer reaches of fantasy from this. And this was issued a good, let's see, 10 years maybe, or not quite 10 years before the Encyclopedia of Fantasy by Clute and Grant, and really, really great stuff. So, you know, these are really useful things. If you can't find the books, then at least you can read up on them and you get the context, because you're in the hands of professional writers here who really know this stuff. They're book collectors and they've steeped themselves in it. So to become an expert, even to the sort of modest level I am, is really, you know, you have to draw on other people's writing, because it's out there, you know, and show some respect to these people because they put the work in. And, you know, it's a lot better looking on the internet. The thing is, anybody can put a website up. It won't be properly edited. It won't be professionally edited. If you look at Wikipedia, for example, I mean, it's incredibly uneven. There's some great stuff on it, but there's lots of stuff which is full of holes and critically very average as well. So books retain their kudos. That's a collection of short stories, so I'll put that out the way. So Lucia Shepherd. I'm a big fan of JG Ballard, as you probably know, and this is fairly recent. This was last year, selected non-fiction from MIT. Was it last year or this year? And the thing with this is good, but a lot of the material in it had already appeared in User's Guide to the Millennium and other places, so I didn't find it as seminal as I hoped. But if you're relatively new to Ballard, you have no Ballard reference books, this is great. And of course, I've worked on Ballard criticism and homage fiction myself in Deep End's anthology. Now, this is kind of a holy grail. I know I've seen one other copy of this, and I think it's my friend Graham has it, and I bought this when I first came across it, which was in I think 1980, late 87, and I ordered it into it. It was published in 84, And this is The Novels of Philip K. Dick by Kim Stanley Robinson, and it's published by UMI Research Press Studies in Speculative Fiction series. Now there are others in this series. I've never seen any of them, never tracked them down. And there's one on approaches to the fiction of Ursula K. Le Guin, which I imagine is fantastic. And interestingly, as this is Philip K. Dick, I can just hear outside the window the refuse collection, the garbage men are here. And that reminds me of Roog, a very early PKD story where there's a dog who's barking, he's going Roog at the garbage men who he thinks are aliens, and they actually might be aliens. But anyway, back to this. This was basically Kim's dissertation for his master's, I believe. I've read it several times, and I read it just after the point where I'd basically read all of Philip K. Dick's work. I started reading it in 77, and by about 85, 86, I'd read everything that had been published. And then at that point, there were some of the mainstream novels which had never been issued were coming out. So I read this after I read all the fiction, with an exception of some of the short stories, because no, that's not true. The short stories I think were all out by then. And this is a really, really great book, and critically it's absolutely fantastic, and it's the best thing Kim Stanley Robinson ever did, in my opinion. Not that I'll admit I've not read any of his recent novels, I've only read the early ones. I always found him quite worthy, dry and dull. He doesn't really work for me. He's obviously a really cool guy though, and that, if you never find it, it's brilliant. This cost me £32 new in 87. Of course, I got my staff discount. No, I've got no idea what it's worth. I imagine quite a lot. Again, on Philip K. Dick, I mean, there have been many books on Philip K. Dick. There's several biographies. You don't really need any of them apart from this one. This is Divine Invasions by Lawrence Sutin, in its Harmony Books US first hardcover, which I bought, and it's actually signed by Lawrence as well. Now, I can't think for the life of me where I got this from. I might have got it from somewhere like Forbidden Planet in London, but 1989, and this is an absolutely brilliant PKD biography. There's a Paladin UK B format paperback edition later on, which is a lot more common. I've read other ones, but you don't really need them. You just need this, really. This is the one. Divine Invasions by Lawrence Sutin. Fantastic. If only we had more biographies of SF writers. There is one I need to get about James Tiptree Jr., which Scott Bradfield mentioned. I must look at that again. Speaking of biographies, there's Nat Segeloff's rather episodic biography of Harlan Ellison, A Lit Fuse, which I enjoyed, but I didn't think was front rank. I mean, I learned some things about Ellison I didn't know. I've been a fan for a very, very long time. I knew a lot of it. And I think that was partially the problem. If this had come out in like 1985, obviously nobody's going to publish a book about Harlan, you know, without him looking it over and what have you. You know, it is good, it's great, but it's rather episodic and jumps back and forth in time. And I wasn't that keen on it, but I wouldn't be without it, because, you know, we loved Harlan for all his flaws and for that moment between about 1960 and the mid-70s where he produced some of the very, very best science fiction stories ever, in my opinion. And, you know, and I will say that I think a lot of his later stuff isn't as good, but when Ellison was good, he was absolutely the best. I mean, at short stories for genre SF, I would put him up there with Alfred Bester. Bester and Ellison were the absolute finest at SF short stories. I really will say that. And you say I'm not a science fiction writer. Well, Harlan, the fact is, you're gone and you can't disagree with me now. It comes down to this. Your very best work was your sterling SF published in that period. And your non-fiction, which was superb. His non-fiction is brilliant. It really has to be said. This is something I picked up a while ago. It's another example of a book you won't see outside an academic library. And I haven't read it yet. And it's going to teach me a lot about books I haven't read. I'm interested in Italian literature. Because I do love Italy, and when I go anywhere, the literary side of things is quite important. This is Italian Science Fiction and the Environmental Humanities, published by Liverpool University Press. And Liverpool Uni, of course, is where they teach the science fiction course. It used to be taught at North London Poly in the late 70s. People like Christopher Priest, Ian Watson, Brian Stableford used to teach on it, and it's up there now, and they've got a special collections library. So I'll get around to that at some point. The thing is, when I get very hungry to read books like this, that's when you know that I'm really, really losing interest in science fiction in terms of the reading of the actual fiction, the short stories and the novels. And there was a point in the mid-90s where I was far more interested in stuff like this than in reading SF itself. But you have to be, because you have to step back, and that's how you get a kind of critical distance, and you have to compare it to other literature as well. Brilliant book, which I have showed on the channel before in my video about some of the better earlier works of Robert Silverberg, is this fantastic volume from Non-Stop Press, Robert Silverberg, Other Places, Other Times. This is fantastic, fully illustrated throughout, lots of pictures and what have you, book covers, and all sorts of little vignettes by Robert about his life as a writer. And it includes a very, very wonderful essay, which is in another book which I'll refer to later on. If you can find this, buy it. It's fantastic. And my love for Silverberg grows and grows, it has to be said. A fantastic book if you're interested in English science fiction, particularly that blurred edge between literary science fiction in the mainstream, and English genre writing, is Nicholas Ruddock's Ultimate Island on the Nature of British Science Fiction, which is published by Greenwood. Now, this is basically a book about catastrophe writing, about catastrophe novels, disaster novels, the English thing, which John Wyndham typified in John Christopher, and to an extent Christopher Priest as well. And basically it puts forward the thesis that British science fiction, particularly English science fiction, is the way it is because Britain's an island. It's a small island, never been conquered. And it talks a lot about how when the disaster novel becomes a big thing in the 50s, it's down to the fact that Britain was losing its empire, the Suez Crisis. It had pulled out of India, and it relates those two things to each other. So if you're interested in British SF, I really recommend this. Your only problem is going to be getting hold of it. Barry and Malzberg, Breakfast in the Ruins, which is also the title of a Michael Moorcock book, a collection of essays about his general bitterness and dissatisfaction with what happened in science fiction, the way it went, how a lot of the figures from the 50s and early 60s are forgotten. And it's a very bracing read. There's another book, which I've shown in another video, called The Bend at the End of the Road. This had a lot of attention. It came out early part of the 21st century and is absolutely brilliant and devastating. And this is the sort of serious criticism that SF needs. It needs to sort of stand back and take a look at itself. And particularly now, in the last 15, 20 years, where there's been very little going on, there's been no real movements of any significance. We have generations of science fiction writers now who've never read anything before Ian Banks and who know very little about the genre. And as a consequence, their work in an evolutionary sense is fairly dull. It ticks the science fiction boxes, but it doesn't really take you anywhere beyond that if you're a more experienced reader. But this is really quite something. Pick it up. Also, a book which divided people a lot, which I actually quite enjoyed. A lot of his friends and fan base really disliked it, is The Inner Man by John Baxter, The Life of JG Ballard. Now, of course, Christopher Priest was working on a biography of Ballard before he died, which is going to be completed by Nina Allen, his partner. And look at that, it's me and JGB side by side. And, you know, I think there's certain things in this which are controversial. A lot of people feel that there was a bit of a sensational slice put on it, but I actually thought it was quite enjoyable. But then I didn't know Ballard as well as, say, Michael Moorcock did. I knew him a little, but not really well. I always found him utterly charming. And I thought that maybe some of the points of view in this, you know, had some validity. But I guess when we get Chris's book, we'll have a rounder view. But there you go. As I say, generally had bad reviews. It was deemed to be a bit of a hatchet job, but interesting. If you're a Ballard fan, you're going to read it all anyway. That's the fact of it, isn't it? Staying on the JGB is the one for me front. This is a book you can get in paperback. We've got it where I work. Extreme Metaphors. Interviews with Ballard 67 to 2008. Always brilliant interviews, always interesting. There are some small books by Research, published in San Francisco. I've got those somewhere as well. They're quite famous and they're quite easy to get. This one, as I say, is still in print. Really good. Ballard always gave good copy, as the newspaper guys said. And one more JGB. This was his book, A User's Guide to the Millennium, Essays and Reviews. The one I referred to earlier on from MIT, a lot of the material is in this. This is a signed first edition, and it's just great. Ballard's really good writing about film and popular culture generally, so that's a good one as well. I don't think this is in print anymore. It can't be that difficult to pick up though. Then we come on to another great writer, the master of mordant wit and irony. And oh, I wish I'd met him. You know, he's such an incredible writer, and I pick up his books and they just fill me with joy. They're so well written and so funny, and yet at the same time they're so black. That's Thomas M. Disch, The Dreams Our Stuff is Made Of. How Science Fiction Conquered the World. And of course, you know, that sounds like very sort of commercial, and this is published by, let's have a look, the Free Press. This is a first edition from the 90s, but of course in Tom Disch's hands it's something quite different. I would urge anybody who's interested in science fiction as an art form to read as much Tom Disch as they can, because he was absolutely brilliant. He grows and grows in my estimation. I just love his work. Really fantastic stuff. I must reread this actually, because it was really great. And there is another one by Tom. This came out a little bit later. This was sort of like towards the end of the century, and I can't even see what publisher this is. I don't recognize the colophon. Okay, and that's Thomas M. Disch on SF, and there he is with his big tattooed forearms, like the bear he was. And this is subtitled A Last Judgment on the Genre from Science Fiction's Foremost Critic. And of course, Disch used to upset the old guard by writing essays with titles like Edgar Allan Poe, Our Embarrassing Uncle. And there's also the one about where he suggests that science fiction is a branch of children's literature. And the thing is, you can usually back these things up. And this is great as well. Really, really good. And I just can't help laughing, because even though he came to a very sad end, very, very sad that he committed suicide. But the thing that was very much in character with Tom, you know, that sort of like, oh God, everything's dreadful, you know, let's have some irony to look back on. I wonder if him and Barry and Malzberg ever had a drink together. You do wonder, don't you? This is the thing. I'm sure somebody out there knows. Then somebody who is thankfully still with us and producing a great novel every year, and for my money he's the best genre SF writer in Britain now, has been for some time, is the very wonderful Adam Roberts. And this is the first edition of his Palgrave History of Science Fiction. This came out in about 2006, I think, and it's been revised and updated since then. I must get the revised one, and this is really good. I have a real fondness for all this is Spree book, but this is really good as well. Adam, of course, is a professor of literature at Royal Holloway and 18th century culture generally. He's a very funny guy. He really knows his stuff. I've never met him. I've always wanted to. He's the only living British science fiction writer that I want to meet and do an event with, that I haven't done a bookshop event with, and maybe it'll happen one day. And really great stuff. The new edition is a paperback. I think it's about 15 to 20 quid. You can pick it up. It's print on demand probably, but yeah, really, really good history of SF. Well worth a read. He's got some interesting parallels to make between SF, the Industrial Revolution, and religion, how it's split, you know, how Christianity split into Protestantism and Catholicism and things. Really interesting ideas, great stuff. Then, this is one from the very wonderful Savoy Books, and again, this dates back to late 80s, early 90s, and this is a book-length interview with Michael Moorcock held by Colin Greenland. So Colin's name is there. You can't read it because of the colour they've put it in. It's called Death is No Obstacle. That's an introduction by Angela Carter. Carter, Moorcock, Greenland. It doesn't come much better than that. And this really is Greenland interviewing Moorcock about how he writes fantasy and, you know, his writing career generally. So it's a real one-off. And of course, you know, Mike, he's done it all really, you know, he's just done it all, and this is great stuff. Pick it up if you're a Moorcock fan. Okay, we're over halfway through now, so we're going to do some paperbacks. This I've read many times, a great little book of essays, Explorations of the Marvellous. Look at that, with a robot coming out of an old school 70s tobacconist. Ah, that takes me back, it really does. It's rather like one of the Doctor Who robots as well, isn't it? And this in hardcover was called Science Fiction at Large, and it was published by Gollancz. And it's wonderful essays in here by all sorts of people. Peter Nichols, Le Guin, Edward de Bono does one on lateral thinking in science fiction. John Brenner, Harry Harrison, Alvin Toffler, author of Future Shock, who's a big influence for John Brenner. Alan Garner, Disch's Embarrassments of Science Fiction. Robert Sheckley, and Philip K. Dick's Man, Android and Machine. And this was a book which came out of, there was a kind of a symposium, a load of lectures at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London in the mid-70s, and great stuff. So if you find this, pick it up. It's a really good read. I've read it many times, and you pick up a lot out of these essays. That's the thing. Great little book to pick up, and this is Hell's Cartographers, edited by Aldous and Harrison, and this is the personal histories of science fiction writers. So it's little mini autobiographies, including Bester, Knight, Pohl, Silverberg, Harrison and Aldous. And basically the best one in here is the Silverberg one, and that is also in the book I showed you earlier on, the Silverberg book I showed you earlier on, and it's called let's see, Sounding Brass, Tinkling Cymbal, and it's about 39 pages long, and it's probably one of my favourite pieces of non-fiction there. I really enjoy it. Silverberg describes his career, and it's just so inspiring. You see this precocious guy come up and he just conquers the world. It's just brilliant, and he's such a good writer. I do wish that more of his non-fiction was available, and I would love it if he'd write a full-blown autobiography, because it's a wonderful piece of work, and I've read it time and time again. Also Bester's working here, which is about 30 pages long, My Affair with Science Fiction. That's really good as well. Great stuff. And of course, when Bester died, he left his estate to his barman. What can you say? There's Damon Knight, Harry Harrison, Pohl. There's a kind of samey. There is a kind of thing where most of the American science fiction writers from the same period are the same sort of thing, and there's Aldous who brings in a nice English angle. But this is a great book. Pick it up. Then a marvellous but controversial book in some ways. This is Dream Makers by Charles Platt. This is the Berkeley first edition, A format paperback. And in the UK, this was called Who Writes Science Fiction, and it was published by Savoy. There was a later edition called Dream Makers published by Xanadu in hardcover, which was slightly different. But Charles Platt, who was a SF writer and editor at New Worlds in the 60s, he basically went out and he interviewed a load of science fiction writers, and they include Asimov, Disch, Sheckley, Vonnegut, Stein, Spinrad, Pohl, Delany, Malsberg, Edward Bryant, Bester, Kornbluth, Burgess, Farmer. He didn't actually interview Kornbluth because Kornbluth was dead. I can't believe he does in that part. Dick, Ellison, Bradbury, Herbert, Knight, Wilhelm, Moorcock, Ballard, E.C. Tubb, Watson, Brunner, Benford, Silverberg and Aldous. Great stuff, and these are really good. And there is a Dream Makers 2 which isn't quite as good, and I've got that up there somewhere. I couldn't actually manage to dig it out, but this is one to read and reread, and I know it so well now I don't sort of need to reread it. But this book for me is controversial because I think Charles has a reputation of being a slightly spiky figure. I met him once and he was fine, but he is one of those people I think who says what he thinks, and he anyway, I'm not going to go into it, that's for another time, but you should read this, Dream Makers, aka Who Writes Science Fiction. You learn a lot out of it. It's really good, and it's it's of its time, which is late 70s, early 80s, late 70s, 1979, but it is really good. This edition is very uncommon. I got this from Mike at Fine Edition Books, so I've not heard from him for a while. I hope he's okay. So there you go. My Savoy one, I don't know where that is. That went a long time ago. This is one that John at Sci-Fi Scavenger showed recently. I bought this when it came out, which I think was 2012. Science Fiction, the 101 Best Novels, 85 to 2010, conceived as a sequel to David Pringle's book. And one thing is very clear. I mean, Paul I've interacted with a lot online. I've had the honour of being between the same covers of him in Deep Ends. Damien, I don't know. I know he's Australian. But it's a good book, And the great thing about this is they put all sorts of SF in you, which isn't published as SF, like The Handmaid's Tale and Under the Skin, all those sort of things, The Sparrow, those sort of things, Jonathan Lethem. And I bought a lot of the books in this as they were coming out. Some I mopped up, And the one thing that's clear to me, you might remember if you've been watching the channel for about 3 years, that I started a 90s TBR, and I had about 10 books which I'd picked up round about that time because I felt I hadn't read enough things that were in this, and I crashed after about 3 books. And the one thing that is very clear to me when you look at the selections in this and read them and compare them to one in Pringle's book, 48 to 84, that was a far, far, far better period for SF than this. It has to be said. The SF in this might be more sophisticated, more hard sciencey, but the fact is a lot of these books have never ever been reprinted, and there's a reason for that. I was talking to Morris at Zardos, All You Need Is Books, the dealer. You'll see on my channel there's various times where I visit Morris, and there's later ones where Jules Burke comes along as well. And basically he says, you know, I can always sell 90s SF paperbacks. You know, people are mad for them. That's because most of them are never reprinted, particularly the American ones. There's loads of those in there. But it does give you a snapshot. But it also emphasizes what I've said when you read books from those 2 different periods, from 48 to 84, and then from 85 to 2010, that something was going on in the late 80s, and that was the end of modernity and the rise of the postmodern, and we saw a slowing down of innovation and culture while it sped up in terms of technology. I've talked about that many times. Book I bought earlier this year or late last year, which I haven't read yet, I've only flicked through it. It's in the British Library series. They do a load of SF anthologies edited by Mike Ashley. It's in wraps, which is very nice. Yesterday's Tomorrows, the story of classic British science fiction in 100 books. And this begins, you know, with H.G. Wells. And the first section is called Wells, Wells and Wells Again, which I'm not going to disagree with. And it goes, what does it go up to? It goes up to the sort of early 60s, really. Ends with The Sundered Worlds by Michael Moorcock. It's got some illustrations in it. And, you know, there are lots of really obscure things in here. And I have to say, my patience with obscure SF between about Wells and 1925 is limited. Some of it is great, but there is also some real also-ran stuff as well. But if you want to know all about it, I mean, there's all sorts of things in it, and a lot of it is great. A lot of it is really, really hard to find. But Mike Ashley, you know, he's been doing this stuff for a million years, so he really knows it. So there you go. Some of these books will probably only be in Mike Ashley's library and the British Library, so there you go. An interesting one, this is a proof copy. The finished copy, which is in print, is a different cover. And this is The Ministry of Truth by Dorian Lynskey, good little writer. A biography of George Orwell's 1984. This is really good if you're an Orwell scholar, an Orwell fan. I really like it. I read lots and lots about Orwell, as well as having read all his works many times. The thing about this is that where Lynskey falls down is that, again, he doesn't know enough about genre science fiction to really place 1984 as an SF novel, and that's his only failing. Otherwise, if you like 1984, this is a must read. I really would say that. We're coming on now to some books which, I mean, I bought these way back in the 80s and 90s. These are mostly little American things. You'll see several of them popping up. This is a classic example of a Starmont Reader's Guide. And this is number 3, Philip Jose Farmer, little chapbook, as you see, by Mary T. Britzy, whoever she is. And this looks at some of Farmer's key works in depth. And these were distributed in the UK by Porpoise Press, who had a bit of a Colin Wilson obsession. They're good guys, actually. And there were loads of these. You know, on the back here, there's a list of the other titles in the series. Loads and loads of them. I only ever bought a few. I sort of focused on people I was interested in. And they're quite in-depth. And, you know, this, for example, makes quite a compelling case for Farmer as a serious writer, which not many people would sort of go for these days. I have to say, returning to Farmer, I've enjoyed them less than I used to, but there are still certain keynote works. But there you go. So, are you going to come across these? You'll find them online. You're unlikely to find them in bookshops, especially in the UK. Here's another one, The Magic Labyrinth of Philip Jose Farmer, a Borgo Press original in the Milford series, Popular Writers of Today, volume 38. So again, loads of stuff. This one is a lot more serious, actually. This goes into a lot of into the symbolic stuff in Farmer, which is really, really interesting. And speaking of Colin Wilson, here's another Milford one. About Colin Wilson, The Outsider and Beyond, volume 21 in Popular Writers of Today. And I haven't read this for years and years and years. See the sticker? $10, slightly higher in Canada. So tell me, Richard, Ira, Ira's not in Canada. Richard and Matt Defoe, are you slightly higher in Canada? What does it all mean, we ask ourselves? Then, this is a great little book, actually. This is published by Macmillan. When did I buy this? Gosh, this goes back. I've read this loads of times as well. 1992, The Profession of Science Fiction. Writers on Their Craft and Ideas, edited by Maxim Jakubowski, good old Maxim, and Edward James, and who's an academic, and Maxim, of course, crime writer, science fiction writer, bookseller, collector, general all-round good guy. And yeah, this is really good. It's got lots and lots of essays by different writers about the craft of writing science fiction. Jack Williamson, James Blish, Naomi Mitchison, JG Ballard, Lagan, Richard Cowper, Norman Spinrad. Norman's one is called Where I Get My Crazy Ideas. D.G. Compton, the D.G. Compton one is really good. Pamela Sargent, Michael Coney, that's a good one as well. Gene Wolfe, M. John Harrison. The M. John Harrison one is typically oblique and, you know, and unstructured. And no, it's not unstructured, it's an interesting structure. Gary Kilworth, David Bryn, Gwyneth Jones, Richard Grant. There's some nice figures in there who are now quite obscure. If you can pick this up too, it's really, really good. I've read this many times. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. You see, that's the thing. By immersing yourself in this stuff, you pick up all sorts of things. And I'm used to doing this in my job. I have things called cheats in my job where often I will know one thing about a writer and beyond their work. And I will use that when I talk to customers. Like I do this with Victor Hugo. I know very little about Victor Hugo, despite having read him, but I know that he used to stand when he wrote. He would write standing up, and he would sometimes lean against the wall. So I drop that in whenever I talk about Victor Hugo, and it adds a bit of character to things, and people remember that. And of course, I don't usually see these people again, so you know I can use it time and time again. So that's part of the fun of the the literary anecdote that you can reuse. PKD Strikes Back. The revised edition of Philip K. Dick in his own words by Greg Rickman, with a foreword by Roger Zelazny. Not a particularly handsome looking book. I mean, it's interesting, but I think there's the book by Paul Williams as well, Only Apparently Real, which I don't have anymore. I got rather fed up in Dick studies, as they could be called, with people going on and on and on about the religious experiences and the Valis, the pink light, all that stuff. And to me, that wasn't as interesting as what was going through his head when he wrote Our Friends from Frolics 8 or Galactic Pot Healer. I was more interested in the work, as it were. All that stuff didn't do it for me. And yeah, it is interesting. But sometimes I think, that's the kind of thing that allows the literati to sort of canonize PKD. Oh, he had these serious visions, and he was a philosophical and religious writer, blah, blah. As I've said before, all good science fiction is philosophy. It's that simple. Specialised things are still out there. This is one edited by Andrew M. Butler, Christopher Priest, Their Interaction. Really nice essays about Chris's work, with a cover which reminds me of Gilbert and George. I have read this, I believe once. It's fairly recent, published by the Science Fiction Foundation, so well worth a look. And that's out of Liverpool Uni, of course, as I say. Here's another one, which I haven't looked through all the way through yet. I've read bits of it, and it is basically, Parietal Games, Critical Writings by and on M. John Harrison. So that's really good. So some of it is by Mike, and some of it is about his work. So there you are. And that's the Science Fiction Foundation again as well. I believe this and the Priest one are still in print. And it's a good chunky tome. So if you're a bit of an M. John obsession, which I have, and I've not read it all yet, I'm sort of saving that for when I'm in the mood for a good bit of SF non-fiction. So there you go. Philip K. Dick again. The Shifting Realities of Philip K. Dick, Selected Literary and Philosophical Writings. I think this is out of print. There was a hardcover of it. This is worth getting if you can, because it's got all sorts of things, and this is philosophical and what have you. But it does also have 2 chapters of the unfinished sequel to The Man in the High Castle. Okay? 2 chapters of the unfinished sequel of The Man in the High Castle. Now, the great thing about Dick was that he didn't write sequels. you know, a lot of the great science fiction writers. I mean, today everybody writes sequels. That's because it's a commercial thing. Publishers want sequels. It's not an artistic thing. The best SF novels are over and they're done. And the writer kickstarts things and gives you something fresh and new each time. So PK did. So he never finished it. And another example of that was Wyndham started one which was a sequel to Midwich Cuckoos. He never finished that either. They never needed to. The concepts were done and they realised this, which is why these books were never finished, because they realised they'd just been spinning them out and they had better and different ideas to go. Not essentially better ideas, but they had fresher ideas to go for. So there you go. But pick that up if you can, if you're a dickhead. There's not a lot to see here, but this is quite a famous book. There was a Penguin Modern Classic reissue of it a few years ago. Is this a first? I got this second. This is an American first, Harcourt Brace, and it dates back to, gosh, 1960. And this is Kingsley Amis's New Maps of Hell, which was Amis's writing about science fiction at that point. And Amis was, you know, a big fan of genre SF. He particularly liked the social satirists of Galaxy magazine, and he believed that Pollen Cornblath's The Space Merchants was the best SF novel. He didn't like any of the new wave stuff which came later. He really didn't like that. But this is good. You know, Amis wrote very well. He's a good writer. You know, despite his conservative leanings and you know, his old fuddy-duddy, you know, with jazz, you know, he didn't like free jazz, for example. You know, he's more in the Philip Larkin school with that. But yeah, nonetheless, good. And I say there was a Penguin Modern Classic reissued a few years back. You can probably still get it. I should pick one up, really. It's a nice book. But I don't really need it, do I? This is the thing. I've got so much. Science Fiction, History, Science Vision by Robert Scholes. Not bad. Oxford University Press, goes back to the 80s. Great stuff. What I'd really like, I've read them from the library, I need to library loan, is some darker Suvin stuff, but it's just so expensive you can't get it. This is similar ballpark to Suvin, and Suvin is kind of seminal, really. Then, Brian Stableford died a while ago, great shame. This is a wonderful book by Brian, The Sociology of Science Fiction, in the I.O. Evans Studies in the Philosophy and Criticism of Literature, number 4. And it's just great, and it's all about the sociology of SF, particularly about fandom, also about science fiction itself and how that affected fandom in the early days of genre SF. Brian also did a book called The Scientific Romance in Britain, which I'd love to have, and I didn't buy it when it was in print. It's really expensive now. This is great. If you never pick it up, pick it up. I've read it several times. More of these great little chat books. Here's one by the very wonderful David Pringle. Earth is the Alien Planet. JG Ballard's Four-Dimensional Nightmare. There you go. And what he does, is this the one I'm thinking it is? Yeah, let's have a look. Yeah, he talks about fourfold symbolism and how it's different materials. He talks about sand and glass and concrete. And I referred to that in a Ballard video I made. And this is really, really good. And of course, Pringle was Ballard's archivist. And he's a really good guy. I've never met David. We interact a bit online. It's just great. I just wish that that you know he would be a bit more forthcoming these days. But you know, I think like a lot of us, he's sort of in retirement from a lot of these things. But yeah, great stuff. Anthony Burgess, The Clockwork Universe of Anthony Burgess, and this addresses Burgess's SF. Primarily, it talks about A Clockwork Orange, of course, but lots of other things as well. And mine's signed by Mr. Burgess there. The one time I met him, great guy he was. And it's a lot about free will, determinism, all sorts of things. It refers to all sorts of books by Burgess. And I used to be a big fan. When I read Clockwork, it had a massive impact on me in the early 80s. And I went on to read 30 of his books over the next few years. I haven't read anything for years apart from a quick dip back into Clockwork. But I seem to remember this was very good. Philip K. Dick, Starmont Reader's Guide by Hazel Pierce. And again, all these I got in the late 80s, early 90s. And Hazel, whoever she is, in this looks at The Man in the High Castle, Three Stigmata, Ubik, Flow My Tears, the short fiction, and his resurgence in the 80s. This was published in 1982, so there you go. So watch out for these things. H.P. Lovecraft by S.T. Joshi when he was merely a gleam in the eye. S.T. Joshi, of course, is now, indelibly associated with Lovecraft because he edited the Penguin Modern Classics editions, and he is the preeminent Lovecraft scholar. So that's an early one by S.T., man who does great work with Hippocampus Press. Another book on Ballard by Peter Brigg, published by Starmont. Look at that. They don't make them like this anymore, which I can't remember anything about. Look at the type in that. Good grief. So I must look at that again at some point. Earlier on, I showed you Nicholas Ruddick's On the Nature of British Science Fiction, Ultimate Island. And this is Nicholas's book about Chris Priest. And this is really good, actually. And there's a wonderful thing in this. He goes novel by novel. And it begins with Indoctrinate and goes up as far as the Glamour. So it covers that real initial period when he goes from being a rather unusual genre SF writer into a total slipstream writer with the affirmation and the Glamour. And he covers the short fiction too. And there's some great writing in this. Nicholas is a fantastic critic, and I've read this several times. And it didn't sort of open the door for me, but it kind of confirmed a lot of things I was thinking anyway, because Chris and I, in many ways, we thought alike, and I think that's why we clicked so quickly when we met. We have certain sort of similar ways of thinking, but I think Nicholas thinks in a similar way as well. But yeah, this is really good. So if you're a Priest fan, do try and pick it up. Again, I don't know how hard these are to find. They're probably quite hard to find these days. Not much to see here, but a fascinating book if you can get it. This is A Short History of the Future by R.C. Churchill, published by Warner Laurie. This is a 50s book, I think, or 60s. Let me just have a look. I got this in Hay and Wire about 1 million years ago. 1955. So what's interesting about this is a future history, and it constructs the future history by looking at dystopias. And it takes 1984, David Karp's one, Fahrenheit 451, and it makes out that they're all part of the same history. And it's really clever. So in a way, it's a work of actual SF. I must reread it. And it talks about the sort of different sort of levels of cruelty in the dystopian societies. And it's really good. Short History of the Future. If you find it, snap it up, even if you're not interested, because you could sell it on. But it's a real cracker. On the home stretch now, and here's Harlan Ellison, Unrepentant Harlequin by George Edgar Sluicer, which I reread a while ago. It was good, actually. It's another one of these Milford Popular Writers of Today volumes. And yet another one, which I still have bagged. I got this from Mike at Fine Edition not too long ago. The Delany Intersection. Delany considered as a writer of semi-precious words. Sluicer's good, actually. I like his stuff. He did that Alison one as well. Isn't that lovely? Fantastic. I really enjoyed this, and it made me think I need to go back and reread a lot of Delany, because it's been so long since I've read the early ones. Great stuff. A wonderful, wonderful book, which I bought remaindered in Blackwell's Remainder Shop in Bristol Park Street, circa 85. Writers of the 21st Century series. They did a load of these. Philip K. Dick. This is a book of critical essays about PKD, and it's absolutely wonderful. And they had loads and loads. There was a Le Guin one, there's a Bradbury one, there are others. I never picked the other ones up, but this is really fantastic. If you see this in any condition, pick it up. It includes the wonderful essay, The Deconstruction of Bourgeois SF, by Peter Fitting, which is about Ubig, which is really, really, really quite something. And I talked about it in a video I did in which I compared Priests in Doctrinaire and Ubig. I know Matt at Bookpilled enjoyed that video. This is really, really something, really quite something. We're going to finish with a couple of bibliographies, and I've got a load of these somewhere. These are Galactic Central biographies, published by Galactic Central. Philip Stevenson Payne was the main man. I got these in the early 90s. And this is a 2-volume set bibliography of Philip K. Dick. I've got a Keith Roberts one somewhere. I've got some others as well. I don't know where they are. They were very cheap, but they're really handy in the days pre-internet when you're trying to get your collection together. I haven't mentioned my book, of course, because you'll see it in the credits. It's worth getting. It's a lot smaller than these and usually a good deal cheaper. But ultimately, the one you must have is the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, which is brilliant. Yeah, there is a website, and the website's brilliant, and it's updated and what have you. This was published in 93, so it's outdated. But the beauty of this is if you just pick this up to look one thing up, you're still looking through it 3 hours later. And that's really how you learn context in SF by reading this book and the sort of books I've shown you, and that gives you context, and then you develop an understanding, because you can't really appreciate and understand SF unless you've got some sort of historical idea of how it evolved and how it worked. And one of the best ways is to read the experts and to read about the great writers and to read their non-fiction, and to get a fuller picture of things. I hope you've enjoyed that. Will I ever buy more non-fiction books on SF? Well, as I say, Dorset Bob has quite a few, and I'm trying not to buy much these days, but I do get very tempted. You know, it's those little corners of things. As I say, what I would like is more sort of biographies, really. I haven't shown Astounding, the book which came out a while ago about Campbell, Heinlein, Clark, or not Clark, Campbell, Heinlein, Van Vogt, L. Ron Hubbard. That was a good book as well, and I think I covered that on the channel, and I know that Richard Rempel at Vintage SF did. Anyway, so there's a rambling look through a ton of books. Now I've got to put all this stuff back. I've only done it for you guys as well. Mind you, I've got to tidy out the corner that you can't see. It's an absolute state. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.